All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Josh Phillips again. Um, I am going to start posting all of my lectures through YouTube now, even the shorter ones that aren't as engaging, as far as like a YouTube entertainment audience would be concerned. And the reason is my students have let me know that posting things through YouTube is a lot easier for them to access, as opposed to me posting straight PowerPoint lectures through our online portal, and that's because they said sometimes the PowerPoints download differently if they have a Mac or a PC or what have you. But YouTube is a video place that everybody can access even on their phones. So it just seems easier to post them on YouTube, and then the students can watch them on their phones and not have to worry about downloading different programs in order to access the material. Um, all right, so because of that, I need to be mindful of the YouTube format and try to get through some of these slides a little bit quicker. Once we go through these slides, then we'll all meet each other on Friday. So what I've done today is I've actually combined two lectures and sort of shortened them up. So for students in my class, this is where we're at in the book. So check it out. Today we're talking about perception and listening. First thing that we should know is that perception is a process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting sensory information. So let's look over here at this well-known optical illusion. In this optical illusion, you can see both an old woman or a young woman, and it can, depend on your perception of the current situation, depending on where you're at in life, right? So things like our experiences and our biases can make us see the world differently. So this is when it comes down to one of my long-standing pet peeves when people go around and use the word my or your in front of the word truth. So when people say my truth or my or your truth, it's nothing that I'm a big fan of. I hate that kind of language. Instead, I think it's more accurate to say, look, like based on my experiences, this is how I read the situation. My opinion of the matter is this. I'm a firm believer in like there is an objective truth out there. It is clouded by our perceptions and our biases, but it doesn't mean that an objective truth doesn't exist. So when people go around and say this is my truth, this is your truth, well, now all of a sudden truth is completely subjective. I think that truth is objective with a capital T. We're all trying to get there. It's clouded by our biases. Therefore, our perception of the situation might be different based on our upbringing, our politics, our religion, our age, race, gender, sexual orientation, those different sort of identity markers. Those things can cloud our judgment of what the sort of absolute objective truth is, but it doesn't mean that an objective truth doesn't exist. So, yeah, if you're with me, let's try to rid the world of using the phrase my truth or your truth and just sort of get back to a more sensible language, which I think would be something like my perception, right? Your perception, my opinion of the matter. I see things differently because I have different experiences. I'm different than you. But sort of truth is, for me, I think, especially as an academic, truth is something that is stable and it is absolute and it is objective, and we're all trying to get there, even if it's, our vision of it is a little bit clouded because of our experience. So with this picture over here, all right, if you see an old woman, all right, so this is the old woman's nose. This is one of her eyes. This is one of her eyes, and this is her mouth. If you, all right, and then what you can also have is a young woman, right, where if this is the young woman's eyes and nose over here, and she is looking away, and then this is her jawline, and this is her ear, right, and this is like a necklace maybe around her neck, all right. So that's how you can see sort of two different realities. With this picture, and it's based on your perception because you might see the world differently. Also, one thing on perception is context does matter. Cultural context, the history, right? The contextual history of the situation also matters. Selection, when it comes to selecting as far as what we see, hear, and interpret, selection is important in this regard. All right. So this is one of the things that I actually research outside of my teaching. I get really, really interested with regard to, if we're talking about, U.S. American politics. I'm not interested in the politics that much, but I am interested in how do we live in a country where there's 330 million people and half the country has a very different view of reality than the other half. Like, how do we get there, right? I am really interested in like how do these divisions happen? How do people completely speak past each other on, you know, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, if we're going to take the two main party candidates for the upcoming presidential election. So, you know, I look at things like, look, if you sit around and you're a person who watches Fox News for 3-4 hours a night in prime time, yeah, it makes sense that you're going to have a very different view of reality than someone who sits around watching MSNBC for 3-4 hours every night, right? You probably have different views on the world based on the selection of sort of what it is you consume. That's an interesting phenomenon to me, all right? So there's 3 ways that selection works, right? So first there's like selective exposure. So you need to be reflexive enough to realize that you only expose yourself to certain news outlets, for instance. And based on that, that's going to sort of cloud your judgment. So when people go around and say, I know exactly, you know, who Donald Trump is, you know, you like him, you hate him, whatever. And then I might ask you, okay, well, who do you follow on Twitter, right? For instance, well, if you're sitting there and say, I only follow Democrats on Twitter, then the exposure you have about Donald Trump is probably all negative, right? And what we know about all politicians as far as like political science surveys is that nobody is purely on the left and nobody is purely on the right. Right? If you're a Republican, it's probably because like 60%, 70% of the issues you agree with the Republican platform and 30% you actually agree with Democrats. You just kind of like tilt right. And same thing is true with Democrats. Nobody is like purely like in 100% agreement with the entire Democrat platform, right? It's like there are, you know, you talk to, you know, plenty of Democrats and they're like, I think, you know, Republicans have it right on about 30% of the issues. All right. But if you're a person who hangs out on Twitter all the time, right, and just follows Democrats or just watches MSNBC or other, you know, sort of left-leaning situations, it's like you are only exposing yourself to one side of the argument. And so obviously the only talking points, the only vocabulary you have is that side of the argument, right? So this is what people don't understand is when you don't expose yourself to a plethora of varying viewpoints, you can't, it actually inhibits your ability to think clearly because you don't have the vocabulary to even address the other side of the issue, right? There are stories out there, if we're going to take this example, right, and you're only watching Democrat stuff, there are stories out there about things that Donald Trump has done that are very good, right? But if you have never been exposed to them, right, you don't even have the vocabulary to articulate what those things are. It's like, of course, there's no way in which you can say, oh, like there's a policy that he did that you actually might agree with, right? Or vice versa, right? If you only watch Fox News and Donald Trump's a saint, then you don't even have the vocabulary to articulate some of the things that he's done that you would actually disagree with because you just haven't been exposed to it. So this is where this division comes from, and it didn't just happen with Donald Trump. It's kind of been going on for a while with this sort of like siloing of our online life. We get to curate, and this is a word out of psychology. I first came across it in psychology literature. We're all sort of curators of our own lives now, which is like, you know, it's a museum, right? My life is a museum, and I sort of make my little like Facebook page or my Twitter account, or you know, I get to choose the specific news channels I pay for and I don't pay for, right? So we just sort of curate our own lives, and they become these sort of like comfortable little lives where everything that we are following and watching is all curated to our preconceived notions of reality, right? So you want to make sure that you're exposing yourself to lots of different items and you don't get siloed into these echo chambers, right? And then all of a sudden you see someone who votes for the other candidate and you're like, how could you even vote for that candidate? I don't understand. The reason is because you've never been exposed to anything that's favorable about that other candidate. And the thing is that there's things that both of these individuals have done that are, you know, laudable as well as condemnable, right? Like there are things that, you know, people do, some things good, some things bad, but you have to sort of make sure that you understand the totality of the person. Selective attention. There is a debate on Tuesday this week. We're getting into presidential debate season. Selective attention is what do you actually pay attention to? So this is something that's really interesting with cable news as well, right? So, okay, we'll take Donald Trump here now instead of Democrat stuff. We'll do Republican stuff. Donald Trump, if he gives an hour-long speech, maybe you only hear the good stuff because you like him, right? So this is one thing that news gets to do. They get to take an hour-long speech from the president, and if they like him, they're like, ooh, we're going to cut out this like 90-second clip of the speech that was actually like super good and patriotic and really powerful and non-objectionable, right? It's like politicians have talking points that all of them agree with, like, you know, truth, justice, the American way, freedom, prosperity, like give everyone a fair shot. It's like that could come out of the mouth of any politician from any party, right? So it's like you can kind of snip around it. I don't know what he said before or after that 90 seconds, but if we're just selective attention, it's like I'm only going to pay attention to the good stuff. My ears perk up when, Donald Trump, says, make America great again if I'm a fan of his. I'm like, okay, that's an applaud line, right? If you don't like Donald Trump, your ears are going to perk up when you sort of like hear him say a policy that you like, oh, I definitely disagree with that policy. So your ears perk up, but you just sort of like ignore the other things that he says during the speech. All right, this plays into what we also refer to as selective retention. So what do you save from the speech? So you might hear the entire speech, but you sort of only save those talking points that you want to save. This is true with regard to personal criticisms. So if you give a speech to 100 people, there might be 3 people actually have negative criticisms of your speech, or something you post on YouTube, right? And those are things that people really get hung up on. They get hung up on the negative comments with regard to selective retention. They completely ignore the fact that 97 people were applauding them at the end of the speech. They completely ignore the fact that lots of people gave them good feedback on their YouTube video. And people really sort of take negative criticism a little bit. They take it, they pay more attention to negative criticism than they do to positive criticism. So selective retention is just sort of what from whatever it is you're watching or consuming, what is it that you actually sort of hold on to for a long time, all right? So these are the 3 ways that we go through this selection process, and this sort of shapes, our reality. All right, this is something I think is really cool. All right, schemata, right? Organize knowledge and information into clusters because the world is full of so much information that we have to sort of like group things together. This is why the human brain stereotypes, right? And I know we hear stereotype with negative connotation, especially when it comes to people, right? But stereotyping happens not just around people, but also around like, places and things and animals and experiences. We sort of say like this new experience is like this old experience that I had, and so I'm going to kind of cluster it into this, this old organizational pattern that I already know. So this is what the human brain naturally does, because again, the world is just full of so much information that we kind of have to like group things together. So we can start making some assumptions about those like things, those things that are like each other. That way we can just kind of get through every day a lot quicker than having to pick everything apart, right? So this is how the human brain organizes. Now, this is incredibly important, social identity theory, all right? We view our in-groups more positively than our out-groups. So if we stay on the politic thing, let's say I'm not going to give away my politics, but for hypotheticals, you can guess whatever I am later. I'll be a Democrat right now, and let's say that my in-group is the Democrat Party, my out-group is the Republican Party, all right? This leads to groupthink, and what this means is that if I'm a part of the Democrat Party, eventually, all humans do this, they start articulating and regurgitating the talking points of the Democrat Party, right? Whatever they see on Twitter or MSNBC or whatever comes out of the mouth of Joe Biden. It's like that's what our thing is, right? Now, a lot of this, right, when it comes to political arguments, especially when we're talking about political arguments between people, when it comes to, Facebook, Twitter, public debates, public forums, a lot of the arguments that people make are made to virtue signal to your group members. So if I'm a Democrat and I'm publicly arguing with a Republican, in social identity theory, what this sort of posits is that I'm not necessarily arguing with that Republican to get that Republican to change his mind. What I'm doing instead is I'm arguing with that Republican, hoping that my other Democrat friends see me arguing online and give me kudos, and that sort of strengthens my position in the group. All right? This is what happens with sort of in-group, out-group stuff. A lot of times we act like I'm going to go fight that person who's not a part of my group because I don't like that other group. But what a lot of it has to do with, right, is I am doing that to uphold my status in my own group. And maybe I get promoted in my own group, right? All of a sudden I become like a city council member or a community leader, right? I sort of like move up, gain status within my group by showing my group that I am so committed to the group and the platform and the tenets of the group that I am willing to fight the people who are not in our group, all right? So this is what a lot of argumentation with outside groups is about. The reason this happens is because if I'm a Democrat and I'm fighting with Republicans, um, I I value my in-group status. Uh, that's what I value the most is my in-group status. I need to be a part of a group, right? And this is what happens a lot with like cancel culture going on right now, unfortunately, is if I'm a Democrat and I say, look, I'm a Democrat, but I disagree with some of these Democrat policies, we see this stuff online, like people get totally kicked out of the Democrat Party. They're like, you can't have any friends anymore. You got to go be on an island by yourself. You are politically homeless. And you're like, but I agree with a lot of your issues. And they're like, it doesn't matter, right? So a lot of people are just trying to uphold their own position in their group by sort of overtly virtue signaling, almost exaggerated virtue signaling. They're virtue signaling so hard and so often just to show other people around them, like, no, 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 I really am a part of this group. Please don't kick me out of the group. All right. So that's what most of social identity theory is about. All right. We create in groups and out groups. Once we're a part of a group, we need to stay a part of that group. And a way that we can gain favor with our other group members, because we don't want to be homeless, right? We don't want to be alone in the wilderness. We are tribal animals, right? The way that we sort of gain favor with our other group members is by constantly showing them, like, I am so deeply committed to the group and the tenets of the group and the philosophy of the group, all right? Even if I have to, exaggerate my positions sometimes, right? I call the other side evil or awful or horrible human beings. I probably don't really think that, right? There's probably people in your family who vote differently than you, but we do that, and part of the reason we do that is to just sort of shore up our own support within our group. We all follow scripts in our lives. So one of the exercises that I encourage you to do, especially my students, I do this in my classes, is I have them take a moment to sort of make a timeline of how their life is quote unquote supposed to unfold, right? Based on the sort of current Americana script. It's like, okay, right? And this doesn't mean like how you want it. Maybe, you're the black sheep of the family or you're an outsider. I mean, as far as like if you were to sort of sketch the life of an average, college student, what would their life look like? And it's like, okay, 18, graduate high school, and then you go to college. When you're 22, you graduate. By the time you're 25, you get married. By the time you're 30, you got 1 or 2 kids and a mortgage and a car, and then you start working your job, and then at 65, you retire, and then you move to Florida and have the end, right? There's nothing written in the human genome that says this is how you have to live your life, all right? There's lots of other paths to take. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to get married at 25. You can get married later. You don't have to necessarily have kids. Some people have kids earlier. Some people have them later, right? But we all sort of like understand that this is a social script. And even if we're pretty confident with who we are, there are ways in which all of us feel this pressure, right? So in a little bit of self-disclosure, not much. I'm 36, right? Not married, don't have any kids. I'm pretty comfortable with who I am in my life, right? But it's like, every once in a while, there's like a little scratch on the back of my head. It's like, hey, like, what's going on? Like everybody else, is like married with kids. You got, siblings are this way too. Like, what's going on with you, Josh? So I'm not immune to, some of the sort of conformity elements of society, right? So you can sit there and be very confident with who you are, as you should. You don't have to follow a script. But these scripts are powerful enough where they shape culture, and culture is just shaped by everyday individual human behavior. Like there's no culture out there, right? When people start to what I call anthropomorphize the idea of culture, I don't like it. When people are like, the culture is, I'm like, the culture isn't anything. The culture is made up of a bunch of individual decisions, right? And those individual decisions, create culture. But when people say like, our culture is these things, like, no, the culture is not. Like individual people make have individual behaviors, make individual decisions. All right. So just think about sort of like how your life is sort of quote unquote supposed to, right? Or like what pressures do you feel with regard to the timeline of your life? And that's what scripts are. Interpretation is a quote from Epictetus that you can read, right? But there's 2 ways that you can interpret things with regard to who you are, right? When people come and argue with you. Internal and external attributions, right? So internal, it's just you explain your own behavior based on your personal characteristics. External is you explain your behavior based on outside factors. So like what other people say about you. Here's the deal. All right. I'm not going to go too much into this. There's a super long explanation, but I think it boils down to something very, very simple, and people can argue with me as much as they want, but I don't think it's useful if you argue in the other direction, right? Think about something in your life that's not going well, whatever it is, right? And you can think about what are the internal attributions, like what did I do wrong? And then you can think about the external attributions, what did other people do wrong? And here's the thing. You might be in a very, very terrible place in your life regarding some topic, right? Family situation, school situation, whatever. You can say, right, and there's plenty of validity to say, like, your parents might have done something wrong, your teachers might have done something wrong, an athletic coach might have done something wrong, your friends, betrayed you, your significant other, like, was manipulative and lied to you, and now, you're single. Like, there's a lot of people who might have done a whole lot of terrible things, right, with regard to your external attributions, right, to make your life difficult. It's 100% true, right? I do not dismiss that very real thing that happens. The problem is this, right, and this goes to Stoicism, which I talk more in depth in some other classes, right? The problem is that you have zero control over these external attributions. You can't control your parents. You can't change the behavior of a significant other. You can't change the past, right? If something happened in high school and now you're dealing with it in college, you can't go back and change that, right? So this is what I tell people to do, right? Even if there are external attributions that explain some of your behavior if, you're not getting what it is you want to get in life. What I tell students is this, is that your life is going to be so much better if you just constantly evaluate and try to change your internal behavior. Because you can't do anything about the external behavior, right? You can sit around and you can complain about it, right? And you can cry about it, and you can be upset about it. But the fact of the matter is you can't change those other people, right? But what you can do is say, look, some other people screwed me over. They hurt me in lots of different ways, right? My teacher might not like me. My athletic coach might be too hard on me. My parents didn't raise me right, That all might be exactly true. The problem is you can't do anything about it. You can't do anything about external attributions, right? So I like this quote from Epictetus: happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within your control and some things are not, right? It's the whole serenity prayer, right? So, I mean, Epictetus was like, BC, and now we have this serenity prayer that's probably on your grandma's house, right? I think it's the Alcohol Anonymous motto too, like, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the wisdom, and to change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So, this is, plenty of people, philosophers, religious individuals have said something similar, right? And what I tell people is, look, just focus on your internal attributions. You're going to hit setbacks because other people are going to, are not going to treat you well, right? You're going to have friends that, don't pull through, right? You're going to have difficult breakups, and you're going to have, you might have difficult time with your family members. But if you can't control it, then you can't, you can't control it, right? So just focus on those things that you can control. One thing I tell my students is, if you're upset because a teacher isn't doing X, Y, and Z, and you don't feel like you're getting the full education that you should be doing, you should be getting, let them know it's like, okay, like what can you control to further your education? One thing you do is go to the library and read, 10 books that you think that you should be reading in order to have some sort of well-rounded liberal arts, classics education. It's like, so have you read some of the books that you think you should be reading in order to get that education that you want, in order to understand the things that it is you want to understand? All right. If they say no, it's like, okay, go check out some books. So with your own personal education, your teacher might be falling short, but you can go to the library, right? With your own personal training, your coach might not be the best coach, but it's like you can get up in the morning and go run 3-4 miles every morning, right? You can do your own little training stuff. Your practice in the afternoon might be terrible because the coach isn't good, but it doesn't mean you can't, you can wake up a little bit earlier and go put in a good workout on your own, all right? So just focus on your internal things, because those are the only things you can control, but just focus on the internal attributes. Hope that the external attributes change one day, but they might not, and you don't want to be in a position where you're sitting around for 5, 10, 20 years for outside things to change so that you can finally get your life together, right? Because you have to realize that the outside attributes, they might never change. So when people say the outside attributes have to change in order for me to get ahead in life, I say it's like, the sad reality of it is that they might never change. And are you going to sit around your entire life waiting for other people to change your behavior, right? Change your own behavior, do exactly what you can do today, hoping the externals change at some point, right? But always just keep doing it. But that doesn't mean that you have to stop working on yourself, all right? Focus on the internal attributes. Okay, Interpretation, we get in this question of who decides, right? So some of the stuff we talked about with free speech earlier is that the problem with censorship, one of the problems with censorship is that meaning is constantly evolving. I'll walk you through this swastika thing here in a second. But one thing that I'm going to post down in the YouTube section in the comments is this C-SPAN video. And it's a talk by John McWhorter. And just watch 13 minutes. It's an hour-long talk, but just watch like the first like 15 minutes of it. And what I think it's from his book. Oh, here you go. It's called Words on the Move. And it's just about how language evolves. So he's a linguist at Columbia. He does some like cultural stuff every once in a while. He's on like CNN giving social commentary about like the country at large. So you might know him from sort of more political discussions, but like his training, he's a linguist. He just talks about how language works. All right. So watch this video, and there's some really cool examples in here. And one thing that he talks about that I think is very pertinent, or it is a good example, is he talks about how Shakespeare is difficult to read now because some of the meanings of the words have changed. And he walks through some of these words that Shakespeare used. So when people are like, we should update Shakespeare, right? Because the words that Shakespeare used 500 years ago don't have the exact same meaning that they have in the year 2020. And I think there's some validity in updating an older text so that modern day audiences can understand it, can read it easier, and so that modern audiences get the same message that Shakespeare was trying to send 500 years ago, right? Because if the word has changed in 500 years, I might read that word today, and if it has a different meaning than when Shakespeare wrote it, I'm actually not reading this quote-unquote same text that Shakespeare wrote because the words have changed. I think if you're a Shakespearean scholar, if you get a PhD in English, for instance, it's like, yeah, you should read Shakespeare in the original, and then you're the one who has to do the work to go find out what the original meanings were. Like, I think that's important. But if it's just like an everyday casual reader who, just is going to have Shakespeare introduced to them, maybe in like a high school English class, yeah, I mean, I think there's some validity to updating some of the words. We do this with Bible translations, right? It's like, depending on the church you go to, you might use the King James Version with all the these and the thous and the thys, and like, I don't understand this, right? Because eventually they updated it, and then we have this new international version. I know back like probably 20 years ago, there was this version that came out called The Message, which is basically like just like a paraphrase of the Bible. Like, it's gone through a lot of translation in 2,000 years. Like there's no sort of equivalent from one meaning to the next meaning. We're changing languages, we're updating word, like it's very difficult, right, to have an exact translation. So you need to always think like, who decides what the meaning is, and does the meaning mean the same thing in this context in the year 2020 as Shakespeare meant it, 500 years ago. So watch this video by John McWhorter. All right, let's talk about this. This is from the website Inside Higher Ed. So this is from 5 years ago. So Inside Higher Ed ran this article, and it was just about, hate symbols on campus, right? If like someone's walking around with a swastika on their t-shirt, it's like, I don't know if I want that person near me on campus. However, there was this incident, there was a handful of these incidents that were going on, where this one was at George Washington University. There was a Jewish student who posted a symbol that he brought back from India, and I think he had it up in his dorm room, or he had it on like his hallway door, right? But it was this symbol, right? And the sort of swastika as we know it today, right? This hateful symbol here, right? This garbage. The Nazis didn't invent this design, if you will. It's like, this is a design that had been around for thousands of years, mostly in Southeast Asia, India, etc., right? In that area, right? And it's been used in Hinduism, Buddhism. They have found this symbol in some older Native American artifacts or carvings in North America even. So this symbol has been around for a long time. The Nazis took it, changed it a little bit. They sort of twisted it, 45 degrees, and made it look a little different. So then you get in this question of like, if somebody uses a symbol that is similar to what the Nazis are using, recognize that the swastika meaning has changed, and then you get a question of like, who actually gets to decide what this is. I know when I've traveled into Southeast Asia, you go into different stores and they have these little rocks and necklaces, and you can buy stickers and get henna tattoos with this symbol on it. And I'm like, I'm not putting that on me, right? But you walk around and at first it's a little bit jarring, right? To walk into a souvenir shop and see a necklace, with this symbol on it. And And then you realize like, okay, like in this cultural context, this goes back to our first slide, like context matters when it comes to perception. In this cultural context, this means something very different. This is not something I would walk around Pennsylvania wearing, especially looking like I look. However, I can understand why there might be some individuals in Southeast Asia, for instance, who are very upset that their very peaceful religious symbol has been appropriated in something so hateful in certain parts of the world. All right. So words and language change. The interpretation changes based on cultural context. Context matters. Listening versus hearing. Hearing is the physical process of sound waves. So you hear a lot of things. Selective attention, you don't pay attention to most of them. Listening is active. You try to understand the meaning. All right. There's this thing called pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening or selective listening. When you have an argument, so this is debate stuff. When you have an argument, don't just wait for your turn to speak in the argument. This is what happens a lot. Someone's arguing with you, and the whole time you're just like, I can't wait till they take a breath so they pause long enough so I can jump into the conversation. You don't want to do that, all right? Because it doesn't, if you actually want to solve the problem, and you only debate people if you are actually want to engage with them to solve a problem, right? Like if you and your like girlfriend, for instance, have a fight, deep in there somewhere, it's like, well, I'm having a fight with this person because I actually want the relationship to last. If you don't care about the relationship, you just say like, oh, me and my girlfriend are fighting. There's an easy way to solve that. We're broken up. I'm leaving, right? So if you're actually want to solve the problem with the person, don't just go in there to try to win the argument. Go in there and say like, we're going to solve this problem. And part of solving the problem is actually listening to the person and allowing a long pause in between them speaking and you speaking. Don't just jump back and forth. All right, that's not going to solve anything. All right, so here's a good debate tip. All right, when you're debating or arguing with someone, do not wait for your turn to speak. All right, you're going to have a turn. You're going to have your turn to speak. All right, before you respond with your defense, right, or your position on the argument, take a couple of minutes to summarize what they just said. All right, so you and your girlfriend are arguing. She's going. She's arguing for 5 minutes. When she's done arguing, you just sit here for like 30 seconds and say nothing. And if she's like, what's going on? Say, I'm just trying to, process what you said. When you first get into it, when it's your turn now, and maybe you have about 5 minutes, right, to respond to her, take the first minute or two and say, okay, this is what I hear you saying. This is what you're concerned about. This is your side of the argument. And then she's able to clarify if that's actually her argument, right? So you're really upset that I'm not doing the dishes. And she may say, no, you're not listening to me. I don't care about the dishes. I care about the fact that, you never listen to me or you never take initiative to clean the house, right? Generally speaking. Doing the dishes is a different conversation than we've been in a relationship for 2 years and I never take initiative, right? To clean and do housework. Those are two separate arguments. So if you can summarize the other person's argument, then the both of you actually know what you're arguing about. Too often, too many arguments, they just talk past each other because both people, one person, I think that, the girlfriend is, yelling about dishes and she thinks that we're having an argument about, my initiative in cleaning the house. All right. So you actually both want to get on the same page. And the only way you can do that is listen to the person, be quiet for 30 seconds, try to summarize, and then paraphrase back to them. Okay, this is what I think you're upset about. This is where I think we are having an argument. Is this the actual argument we're having? And then when they say, yes, it is, now I can offer a defense for that particular argument that we're having. All right? Because doing the dishes could be a deeper issue, or it could literally be like, so you want me to clean my dishes? And you want me to clean out my, bowl of oatmeal from this morning? And she could say, yes, that's all I want you to do. Okay, easy. That's solved. I go and I wash the dish. But sometimes I might say, is that what you want me to do? And she's like, no, that has nothing to do with this. All right? So you want to make sure that you're actually arguing. You both know what the argument is about. Here's a couple examples. So the person in red and the person in black ink, these are two different people. So selective listening, I guess this is a Trump example, right? So a person could say like, I voted for Donald Trump, and someone could respond, oh, you're sexist, racist, bigot. Then the person says, so they're trying to summarize back, and you say, no, I just like his tax plan. I think he's, a good person to create jobs. Oh, I understand. So you only care about rich people. And you're like, okay, no, I think that his plan, helps to make money. I think his plan does that for all people, right? So this is what happens in this sort of like back and forth summary with regard to if you and your uncle are, arguing at Thanksgiving, let's say he votes for Trump and you vote for Biden. This is usually what happens is person one says, I vote for Trump. Your uncle says, I vote for Trump. And then maybe your mom, comes back with something that he didn't say. And what we see in this example is the person in red is trying to clarify their remarks because the person in black ink here is not summarizing their thoughts accurately. All right. So before you can get into a debate with regard to your opinion about the president, you both actually have to understand why it is that certain people voted for the president and what was on their mind when they went into the voting booth, right? So why is it that your uncle voted for Trump? You actually need to understand that before you just start accusing him of things that weren't even in his head. All right. Another example here with regard to the wage gap between men and women as far as work. You can pause this and read this through your own, but similar type of thing, right? So two people arguing about economic policies, women earn less than men, and then this person says, okay, that's true, but I think, it's because women and men value different things with regard to lifestyles and family life and, where they want to spend their time. Then the person in black ink here says, oh, you think it's okay for women to be discriminated against? No, that's not what I'm saying, right? So this back and forth of like both these individuals trying to figure out what it is that they're actually arguing before they can get to solution. And too often debates, they just end up with people speaking past each other because they can't actually agree on the premise of what it is we're actually arguing about, all right? So you don't want to just jump in, right? You vote for that person, I vote for this person, let's yell at each other across, a bar stool. You got to pause. You have to summarize their arguments back and say, okay, I understand. Like you voted for Donald Trump because you think that his tax plan is really good. Can you tell me more about the tax plan? Now we're going to argue about tax plan and policies, right? And that's actually going to get us somewhere on an actual deeper political, philosophical debate on like what are proper tax rates, right? As opposed to some stuff that neither one of us can agree with regard to this idea of like racism and sexism. Within policies, right? Now your uncle might want to argue about that, maybe not. But if he says no, like I'm sitting here talking about tax policies, right? I'm a small business owner. I like lower tax rates. Okay, that's the conversation we're having then. All right. So just make sure you know what the conversation the other person's having with you. Okay, finally, for my students, you are going to be reading The Raven and turning in a response, and we're going to go over this on Friday of this week. Couple quick items with regard to perception and context. The Raven has a lot of old-timey words in it, all right? And one thing that I let my students know with regard to like rhetorical analysis is you will appreciate art and literature and music a whole lot better if you understand the context of the time period it was written in, and if you can sort of understand the context of all the symbolism. So most time when we read like older poetry or read older books or go to a museum and look at a painting, we have very little idea of what the symbolism is. And we like in poetry, for instance, we just sort of see a big word and we just kind of read past it, right? So in The Raven, for example, right, there's the word palace, this bust of Pallas, right? And most people are going to read that and they're like, okay, this raven's on a bust of Pallas, no, right? Nevermore, okay? The thing is that if you actually take a second, you're like, I don't know what that word is. Let me dig into it a little bit. It makes the story a lot more interesting. All right. So real quick on The Raven, it's the only one I'll give away because then my students will look at some other stuff, right? The raven has like just the fact that it's a raven as opposed to a dove. It's like, ooh, like that's an interesting distinction, right? Doves mean something different in sort of classical literature than ravens do, right? This bust of Pallas, you're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, this sets the scene, right? So Pallas is this sort of figure of wisdom, right? This sort of like goddess of wisdom. And you're like, ooh, that's something interesting. So you got a guy late at night, he's sitting around, he's reading a book, he's got this like bust of a person who's very wise and knowledgeable, right? And you're like, okay, maybe he's like a scholar, right? So he's probably thinking he's a very rational, reasonable person, but he's having this sort of emotional breakdown, right? And so, okay, now all of a sudden the Raven is a story between a very rational-minded, scholarly person and somebody who's like very much having this sort of this emotional tension, right, going on, right? He's probably not used to a lot of emotional stuff. So all of a sudden, this sort of like logic versus emotion tension comes into play within this poem, The Raven. All right, that's one little thing to look at. All right, and there's lots of other these old timey words, right? That happen in The Raven. But if you kind of understand what those words mean, all of a sudden you have a larger appreciation for the story that is actually trying to be told, as opposed to, hey, there's a raven, it's kind of scary, and it says nevermore a lot, and it's dark and it's rainy, right, and dreary outside. Start digging into the words, and all of a sudden you have a greater appreciation. This is what I tell my students with regard to art and museums. Anytime before you go to a museum, look the museum up online and find like 5 paintings and try to just learn a little bit of history about those paintings, and then you go and you look at those paintings and you're like, okay, I understand what the artist was trying to do here. Otherwise you walk by a painting and you're like, it's aesthetically pleasing or it's not aesthetically pleasing. I like it or I don't like it, and I move on. You learn a little bit about the history of the context of how that painting was made and where it was made. All of a sudden you're looking at that painting and you're going to appreciate it a lot more. All right. So when you're reading The Raven this week, all those words that you are unsure of, highlight them, look them up, do a little bit of research on them, figure out, what does the raven mean, right, in different sort of cultural, historical context. And that's going to give a lot more meaning to your assignment. All right. For your response paper, right, again, don't turn in incompleted work. It's due on the day that it's due. You can find the poem The Raven online. It's not that long. You can watch somebody. You can watch famous actors recite it on YouTube if you want. All right, 2 to 3 pages. 1.5 pages is not 2 pages. Again, APA format, double space, Times New Roman, 12-point font, all that kind of good stuff. It's not a summary. All right. Instead, I want you to connect some ideas of perception and listening. Go into the textbook a little bit. Connect it to The Raven. The poem. All right, so you already did this with the Frederick Douglass talk. Clear introduction, body, conclusion. Where can we go with this? Paper should be APA format. You don't have to have any sources. It's just your analysis of it, right? And see the syllabus for the due date, which is on Friday. All right. So 2 pages. Write about the Raven. Read it. Dig into some of those older words and figure out, what is the symbolism here? Right? What am I supposed to learn from this? I'm trying to actively listen to the poem as opposed to like, I hear it, it's kind of scary, it's Halloween time, woohoo, right? Dig in and just try to really understand what the message that the author is trying to convey in this, all right? Okay, that's all I have for this week. This is the PowerPoint for both Monday and Wednesday this week, and I will see you on Friday to discuss. All right, bye.